Tēnā koutou katoa, no mai, haere mai. I'm Professor Heather Dyke. I'm currently head of the philosophy programme, and I am delighted to welcome you all to this public lecture given by our current Dan and Gwen Taylor Fellow, Dentith. M is currently Associate Professor of Philosophy at Beijing Normal University. Their areas of expertise are the epistemologies of conspiracy theories, fake news, and secrecy. M's managed to become one of the foremost scholars, if not the foremost scholar, in the field of the philosophy of conspiracy theories, which has become, partly because of M's efforts, a very hot topic in social epistemology. And of course, I expect the reason why you're all here, it's a very hot topic more broadly. Social media and other factors in our modern world encourage the rise of conspiracy theories. M was awarded a PhD from the University of Auckland and is the author of The Philosophy of Conspiracy Theories, 2014, the first single-author, book-length treatment of the philosophical issues surrounding conspiracy theory. M has also edited 2 collections of essays, Taking Conspiracy Theories Seriously, 2018, and The Philosophy of Conspiracy Theories, Concepts, Methods, and Theory, 2024, as well as editing 2 journal special issues on the philosophy of conspiracy theories, and of course writing a multitude of journal articles on the subject. Today, M will be talking to us on the topic of, is there something in the water? Conspiracy theories and conspiracy theory in the Antipodes. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just put my power pack away. So, tēnā koutou katoa, ko inarangi te whakapapaoranga mai, inare, ko Devonport te whenua tupu, no tamaki mokoru o, ke China o I nono ana. He Associate Professor of Philosophy o I Beijing Normal University at Zhuhai, me Beijing Normal University, ko M.O. tēnā tātou katoa. I also apologise for the Pākehā pronunciation. I'm also aware, given I'm in Kaitahu territory, I also apologise for the North Island Pākehā pronunciation there. You get 2 types of apology. So yes, today I'm giving a talk, Is There Something in the Water? Conspiracy Theories and Conspiracy Theory in the Antipodes. And as Heather pointed out, conspiracy theories are big news and big business. I often like to joke that one of the problems of studying conspiracy theories in the contemporary era is that there are a lot of things we could be studying, and it would be a lot more convenient from a kind of academic perspective if this was merely a historical survey of things that people have believed in the past. Because as I was preparing to leave China to come down here, the really big conspiracy theory that took off in the United States was, of course, the whole furore about what happened to Jeffrey Epstein, what happened to the clients of Jeffrey Epstein, and why is the video that the American government has released about the night that Jeffrey Epstein died raised more questions than it's provided answers. And if you've been following the news over the last few days or over the last few weeks, this problem seems to be getting bigger and bigger rather than smaller and receding into view. So there are a lot of conspiracy theories, and we seem to know an awful lot about them. And of course, conspiracy theories aren't simply things that happen overseas to other people. There are numerous conspiracy theories being talked about with respect to our own local policies. Indeed, we have politicians in our current government who are conspiracy theorists par excellence. Whether it be the way that David Seymour is brushing off complaints about the various bills he's put forward in Parliament, accusing people of having sinister agendas opposing his policy portfolios, or the fact that our former Deputy Prime Minister, in the form of Winston Peters, has been talking about how there is a woke conspiracy designed to pervert the natural way that the New Zealand polity is meant to work. We see a lot of conspiracy theories both overseas and also here in our own Aotearoa. And the thing about these conspiracy theories is because they are big business and they end up being big news, they get discussed. They get discussed by people in politics and positions of power. Sometimes that discussion is one which is, oh, what ought we do about these conspiracy theories that so many people believe? And sometimes it's, here's the conspiracy theory I happen to think is true. Of course, the media talks about conspiracy theories because when these conspiracy theories are being discussed by people in positions of power like politicians, the media, of course, has an interest in reporting those stories to the people. And sometimes they're reporting on conspiracy theories, and sometimes they turn out to be disseminating conspiracy theories. And so because the media has an interest in the conspiracy theories that people in positions of power discuss, academics, of course, have become interested in the conspiracy theories we're seeing being discussed in public discourse. And amongst some of those academics, you will find philosophers. Because I am a philosopher, I study conspiracy theories from a philosophical point of view, and this is my presentation about why and how that came about. Now, for this to work, we do need a bit of terminology. Sorry, I sound like I'm a magician now going, but for this to work, we need to do a bit of preparatory stagecraft. But we do, because this is a philosophical talk. So we need to talk about conspiracy theory. This is the academic interest in conspiracy theories, i.e. we are theorizing about what constitutes a conspiracy theory, what constitutes belief in conspiracy theories, and how we should talk about conspiracy theories. So this is conspiracy theory, the academic or scholarly discussion of these things called conspiracy theories. And here on screen is an example of a conspiracy theory theorist who was captured on film, actually probably not film, using a CMOS sensor on this very campus last week. And look at the quality of person that turned out to be a conspiracy theory theorist. Would you want to be sitting next to such a person on a long flight from Guangzhou to Auckland? I don't think so. Now, conspiracy theory is a broad church in that it includes the academics who study conspiracy theories. An awful lot of the work that we see in conspiracy theory comes out of psychology, because psychologists are interested in why do people have particular beliefs, and social psychologists, who are doing the lion's share of the work on conspiracy theory, want to know in what kind of societal complexes do people have beliefs like those in conspiracy theories. And of course, when we start talking about conspiracy theories in societies, we're also talking about the sociological work, the people who are going, what kind of places or what kind of cultures engender belief in conspiracy theories, or in some situations lead people to not believe in the conspiracies that are going on around them. And this is work that anthropologists are also doing, looking at the kind of anthropological complexes in which conspiracy theories flourish or fail, and also the kind of complexes in which conspiracies succeed or fall down. Occasionally, you'll find physicists who decide that they also want to opine on the nature of the conspiracy theory, whether they're talking about the evidence used in support of a particular conspiracy theory, or working out mathematical proofs as to why belief in conspiracy theories might be bad under certain conditions. And of course, as I mentioned, there are philosophers. And the reason why I'm giving a talk about the conspiracy theory of the Antipodes, because unfortunately, as I'll say, we can't just talk about Aotearoa, New Zealand here. We do have to talk about our near neighbour of Australia, is that the philosophical work on conspiracy theory is itself interesting. It's interesting because of its genesis, and it's interesting with respect to what philosophers in the Southern Hemisphere think about conspiracy theories compared to academics elsewhere. Because most psychologists, many sociologists, some anthropologists, and the few physicists who have written on conspiracy theory have a rather dismal view of the notion of the conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theories are generally bad beliefs. They are held by irrational people, and when you encounter a conspiracy theory or meet a conspiracy theorist, you are entitled to a large degree to think that they have beliefs which are mad, bad, or dangerous of some particular kind. But philosophers, at least in the Southern Hemisphere, have thought slightly different. And I want to use this talk to both explain the history of why that came about, engage in some baseless speculation of a sociological nature as to why that may have come about, and then make claims as to why, even if we can't give a sociological story, there is an importance to this work which is echoing through work more generally in conspiracy theory to this day. So this is, unfortunately, a talk in 3 parts, or I've put here, a play in 3 acts. The first act is history. I will introduce you to a cast of characters and tell you a little bit about their story and how we got to the present day. The second act will be sociological. I am going to speculate as to why it is philosophers in the Southern Hemisphere have had a particular view on conspiracy theories that seems to go against the grain of what a lot of academics have thought elsewhere. And the third and final act is going to be philosophical. I'm going to say that this work is important and this work has had import. There are philosophical consequences to the views expressed by people in the Southern Hemisphere on the philosophy of conspiracy theory, which has improved the tenor of the academic debate. Now, because I'm going to be talking about history and sociology, and I'm neither a historian nor a sociologist, I must apologize in advance for the folk history and folk sociology that I'm going to engage in. Essentially, this is a talk that will probably please none and irritate many. In that the historians will say that I'm not giving a proper history, the sociologists will say that's not very good sociology, and the philosophers will say we wanted some more philosophical content. But this is a public talk, and you are the public, and I do not know what parts of the public you are in, so I'm hoping at least some of the things I'm saying today are going to have resonance and will be things that if you don't take home and rave about, you'll think about for time to come. So with that said, let us now move on to the history. Is there something in the water? Well, if we're going to start our history, we really need to start with Karl Popper. Now, it's probably a stretch to say that Karl Popper was a New Zealand philosopher. It is true, he worked down in the South Island, but you do get the impression from the correspondence Karl Popper had that his time in New Zealand was not the greatest time of his life. When he was able to flee to the UK to begin his career in earnest, he was happy to leave the Southern Hemisphere behind. But whilst he was working in the South Island, he started work and published at around about the same time he left for the UK, the 2-volume set, The Open Society and Its Enemies. And in The Open Society and Its Enemies, Popper starts talking about conspiracy theories, or at least he talks about 2 particular concepts: the conspiracy theory of society and the conspiracy theory of ignorance. And so Popper is interested in why do people have conspiratorial beliefs? And he goes, well, look, there are some people who believe that conspiracies are the motive force of history. They put everything down to a conspiracy. And that kind of view is obviously wrong. Non-conspiratorial causes play a part in the development of history. And some people also think that we are being kept down by people in positions of power who have a kind of absolute power over our information system. This is the conspiracy theory of ignorance. And those people are also fundamentally wrong. Now, admittedly, Popper is writing in the 1930s, well, starts this work in the 1930s, publishes it in the mid-1940s, and has a view of the media and indeed a view of the way societal institutions work, which may seem at odds to our understanding now, but this is Popper writing at this particular point. This work originates in this country and ends up being, if not the first academic analysis of conspiracy theories, amongst the first few bits of writing we find in the English-speaking world on the concept of the conspiracy theory. And for a period of time, this is it. This is kind of what people think about conspiracy theories. But things change, and they change at this very university. Now, I'm going to make an apology in advance. I had a variety of options for photographs of the next hero of our story, and I did have to take the one that was, in part, the most ridiculous. I feel I'm justified because there's already been a stupid photo of me in this presentation thus far. I had hoped that I was going to be able to find ridiculous photos of all the people I'm going to be talking about throughout this section. As you'll see, there's one more slightly skew photo to come, but it turns out most philosophers are sensible and don't allow journalists to take photos of them with tinfoil hats outside the university or allow their heads to be photoshopped onto. Actually, Charles, do you own that? It is a Photoshop case here?
No, I actually put on a suit.
Really? Oh. So I think it's the way it's been shot. It does make your head look as if it's not quite attached. But yes, so this is Charles Pigden. He is sitting in the front row, and I am aware that I really shouldn't be talking about Charles whilst he's here. He is a much better raconteur about his own life than I'm going to be. But Charles, in the early to mid-90s, has to one day sing for a supper. There is an old student of Popper who is at Otago. He's turned out to be a brewer, and he invites graduate students and the like to attend a kind of soiree where, according to Charles, they drink very bad homebrewed beer, and to kind of justify the supply of this beer and also apparently very bad pizza, a party piece has to be performed. And Charles is aware this person is a fan of Popper and wants to say something Popperian, but also something interesting. So he goes through his open society and its enemies, he finds the conspiracy theory of society, and he writes something about the idea that, well, look, Popper might be right. Some people may well think that conspiracy theories are the motive force in history. But that's actually not what most conspiracy theorists believe. Most conspiracy theorists are saying, look, conspiracies play a role in history, and in some cases may play a really big role, or sometimes a very small role. But essentially, the Popperian view, which does kind of have, if not an explicit orthodoxy of people talking about Popper, seems to reflect the way that most people think about conspiracy theories, isn't the right way to go about analyzing individual or particular conspiracy theories. So Charles ends up writing Popper Revisited, or What is Wrong with Conspiracy Theories, expressing this particular idea. And this gets published in 1995. And it is not an understatement to say this is the ship that launched a fleet of conspiracy theory works in philosophy. And it starts here in this country, somewhere quite close to where I am standing and you are sitting now. This is the beginning of a literature, and it starts here. Now, I'm already about to break my rule because our next philosopher isn't even close to the Antipodes. He's also the only philosopher I could find that had a slightly strange photo. This is Brian L. Keeley. Here he appears to be channeling the spirit of Anton LaVey, head of the Church of Satan, given the rather gauche beard. Brian now sports a much more serious academic beard. This is the last, well, actually no, that's not true. There's one more amusing photo to come, but that's about it. So in 1999, Brian L. Keeley writes a paper called Of Conspiracy Theories, in which he talks about how, look, Many people think conspiracy theories are in some sense mad, bad, or dangerous ideas. And some of them are. And he wants to explain why it is we're justified in thinking some of these conspiracy theories are bad. Now, Brian is not from the Antipodes, so Brian does not realize the value of a cheese-based analogy. I should also point out I'm a vegan, so I'm also not very good at cheese-based analogies. But Brian talks about this idea that there are some conspiracy theories which appear to be mature. And we can understand maturity in the same way that we understand appraising whether or not you should eat a cheese. Some cheeses stink. When those cheeses stink, that stink may be a sign of its deliciousness. Or it might be a sign you should probably throw that cheese out. So some cheeses have a stench, and that is a warning stench, and some cheeses have a stench, and it's a sign of deliciousness. If you don't know what cheeses are lurking in the back of your refrigerator, if you find a smelly cheese, you have to go, what should I do with it? And the sensible thing to do, if you don't know what kind of cheese you're working with, and it has a particular stink to it, is you might go, well, there's a chance it's one of those smelly, delicious cheeses, but maybe I should just throw it out, because it might not be safe for me to consume this cheese at this time. Now, I say, Brian doesn't know the value of a dairy-based analogy here, but essentially that is maturity. There are some conspiracy theories which have persisted in public discourse for a really long time. And that might suggest that there's no good evidence to support them. They've just continued to be talked about, but no evidence positive has accrued for that particular theory. And therefore, we should probably treat that theory with some suspicion. It smells because we don't know what kind of theory it is, but it's been around for a long time and there's no definitive proof. So you should push it to one side and discard it. But as Brian notes, that doesn't necessarily mean the theory is false. It is possible it might be a delicious cheese. It's not very likely, but it is possible that if it's persisted for a long time, it's because either the right kind of evidence you need to prove it has simply never been made available, or arguably, someone may have been keeping evidence from you. And so Brian talks about the maturity of conspiracy theories and says, look, we are justified in thinking that conspiracy theories that have been around for a long time are probably bad ideas, but it doesn't necessitate that they are prima facie false. They may turn out to be true. It's just that it would take extraordinary circumstances to be able to work that out. And so with Charles's work in 1995 and Brian's work in 1999, suddenly a lot of literature in philosophy, and it's a lot compared to the period of time between Karl Popper and Charles Pigden, starts to emerge. We get the Australian, Steve Clark, with his 2002 piece, Conspiracy Theories and Conspiracy Theorizing. Here is Steve wistfully looking off into the distance, in which he says, look, conspiracy theories may resemble degenerating Lacatosian research programs, in that it does seem that a great many conspiracy theories seem to resemble bad scientific research programs, where people keep on trying to rescue the theory by putting ad hoc modifications or ancillary hypotheses into the surrounding of the core of the theory to make the theory fit the evidence. And we often take this to be a bad thing, although, as Steve points out, programs that look like they are degenerating can, in some cases, be rescued if we get a kind of shift in our understanding of how theories work or new evidence comes to light. So, like Keeley, he's saying, look, this is an indication of badness, but it's not an absolute one. But Steve also makes the important point, a point which Charles had also made back in 1995, no matter what we think about conspiracy theorizing, it may well promote vigilance in our democratic societies when people start muttering, is there a conspiracy behind it? Being aware that people can conspire means that we should be wary of a general dismissal of these things called conspiracy theories. This is something which is picked up by the Tasmanian philosopher, David Cody, here kind of balefully glancing off into the distance as opposed to Steve Clark's wistful look, in which he talks about how there really isn't a satisfactory distinction between a conspiracy theory and an official story or official theory. There are many theories of the world which are called official and yet end up talking about conspiracies. And David says it's a kind of fool's errand to think there's a useful distinction between a theory being about a conspiracy and a theory being official and also involving a conspiracy. It's a distinction which does more harm than good, and thus, if we're going to talk about conspiracy theories, we should admit that many official theories are conspiracy theories as well. Neil Levy, who's another Australian philosopher, in his Radically Socialized Knowledge and Conspiracy Theories, he takes a slightly different tack. Neil is the person who has a general suspicion of conspiracy theories amongst the Antipodean philosophers. And he says, look, embracing conspiracy theories as a kind of corpus of beliefs puts us at the risk of being able to engage in genuine inquiry in the world. If you believe a lot of conspiracy theories, then you're not going to trust what experts believe about the world, and this can lead you down a dark path. So from Popper to Charles via Brian, we start to get a rather interesting discussion about, is belief in conspiracy theories necessarily bad? And if it is bad, how do we diagnose that badness in such a way that we also recognize that conspiracies occur and some things which are called conspiracy theories end up being true? And that brings us to me. This is our other ridiculous photo here. So all of the images you've seen which haven't been pictures of people are pictures of a place called North Head. North Head is a military installation located in Devonport over in Auckland. It's where I grew up. And this is where I go a little bit autobiographical to explain my entrance and then role in this literature. North Head in Devonport is the site of its own bespoke conspiracy theory. In the build-up to what was taken to be a Prussian scare, when we were afraid of the Prussian Empire coming into our territorial waters in the 1890s, the British War Office requests that the Dominion of New Zealand erect a variety of naval fortresses and fortifications around the coastline of our country. Devonport in Auckland, New Zealand ends up being one of the bigger coastal fortifications developed by the Victorians. They build tunnels into the hillside, they put gun emplacements there. The Prussians end up not attacking, but of course in the build-up to World War I, there is a fear of a war in the South Pacific, so the War Office once again demands that Auckland be fortified, so North Head gets upgraded again. Nothing happens. The build-up to World War II also leads to orders from the War Office, fortify the country. North Head gets upgraded again. Once again, nothing happens. I will point out one of the guns on North Head did cause a fatality. It caused a fatality because it was moved to Newmarket. It was put in the middle of a busy road and a drunk driver drove into it at high speed. So the only fatality associated with North Head actually occurs on the other side of the harbour and isn't in any way due to enemy fire in any way, shape or form. So Devonport ends up being this kind of hub of activity for tunnel building and the like. In the 1980s, a conspiracy theory appears that the North Head Tunnel complex is larger than it appears, that there is a hidden military base in the depths of Devonport. I am growing up in Devonport at the time that these stories are being spread. My father, who grew up in Devonport before me, he is adamant there's nothing to these stories. His best friend, Evan, who used to play with my father at the base of North Head, is adamant that he and my father have been inside this hidden military base. So you have two best friends disputing things that happened to them 30 or 40 years ago and having a big discussion as to whether the conspiracy theory is true or false. So I'm growing up around this. There are two official government investigations into this. So the Department of Conservation does a historical investigation into the building and establishment of North Head. They eventually do an archaeological investigation in order to see whether there are missing tunnels within the head, and they find no evidence, and that leads half of the residents of Devonport to say, we told you so, there's nothing to it, and the other half of the residents to go, you know, it'd be really good at hiding the existence of tunnels. The military, no wonder the Department of Conservation couldn't find anything. So I grew up with a conspiracy theory developing around me. I was kind of primed to be interested in conspiracy theories. But also, unbeknownst to me, I was the victim of a conspiracy. At the age of 38, I discovered I had an older brother. This older brother was born of both my parents. So both my mother and my father had had a child 2 years before I was born, given this child up for adoption, and then, because it was a closed adoption system, never talked about it again. So my parents knew I had a sibling, as you'd kind of expect, that at least one parent would know about this. My grandparents knew, my aunts and uncles knew, and several family friends knew about it. And they had spent 38 years assiduously not only not talking about the existence of my older sibling, but also ensuring that in situations where elderly relatives who forgot that certain people didn't know about things were steered away in particular conversations so I would not find out. So I find out I have an older sibling, and I start questioning every single family interaction I have had in the last 38 years, going, when they were talking about Christmas cakes, were they talking about Christmas cakes, or was there a kind of implied, and also there is a sibling? So arguably, there may well have been something else going on there. Whatever the case, in 2007, actually end of 2007, beginning of 2008, I start work on a PhD. This is a PhD looking at the work of philosophers of conspiracy theory, not just in the Antipodes, but in the world as itself. And I write a PhD thesis. This then leads to my producing a book and my first paper, when inferring to a conspiracy theory might be the best explanation, where I argue that, look, given the history of conspiracy in our societies, given the way that evidence works and the way that we appraise rival explanations, there are going to be cases where no matter what you think about conspiracy theories, some of them are going to end up being the thing you ought to believe given the available evidence at a particular time. Was that due to my growing up around a conspiracy theory and being conspired against at the same time? Possibly. I mean, maybe. We'll never know. We'd have to run an experiment where we take me in another reality, do the same processes, but remove the brother conspiracy and see what occurred. But certainly it seems like it might have been a bit of a motivating factor to get me to where I am today. And from that, my work kind of commenced. Off of the back of the other people in the Antipodes doing work on conspiracy theory, and leading to, as the Australian philosopher Patrick Stokes saying, there being a remarkable consensus in the philosophical literature coming out of work from the Antipodes that, compared to many academics overseas, conspiracy theory theorists in philosophy down under are of the opinion that there's nothing inherently irrational about believing conspiracy theories. Rather, if you are going to say a particular belief in a conspiracy theory is good or bad, you have to explain why it is good or why it is bad. And this consensus, which Pat talks about in his paper between generalism and particularism is a consensus of we ought to be particularists about conspiracy theories. And by particularist, we simply mean the claim that, look, if you are dealing with a particular conspiracy theory, whether it be a claim that, say, David Seymour is acting at the behest of the Atlas Network, or that there is a cultural Marxist philosophy infusing our country, thus making us all go woke and pro for DEI-style initiatives, then you need to ask, is this a good theory? Like we would any theory about the world. We need to assess the conspiracy theory on the merits of its particulars, rather than generalizing about the idea that conspiracy theories are inherently, at least in some sense, mad, bad, or dangerous ideas. So we get this small but illuminating literature originating in the Antipodes, coming from a reaction to the work of Karl Popper, being developed by various philosophers over time. And I should point out, the story I've told is a very selective genealogical retelling here. It's not as if Charles wrote one paper in 1995 and then sat on his laurels for the rest of his life. Charles has continued to publish, as has Steve Clark, as has Neil Levy, as have Americans like Brian L. Keeley and the like, and of course myself. There's now this voluminous literature, and it all points in the direction. We shouldn't think of conspiracy theories as necessarily bad. Rather, we should consider conspiracy theories like any theory and judge them on their merits, rather than just assuming that they are, in some sense, mad, bad, or dangerous. And so this is the particularism versus generalism debate. And what's interesting is that the philosophers down under seem to be, with few exceptions, people who argue for the particularist framework, the idea that we should be assessing conspiracy theories on their particular merits, rather than assuming that because they are conspiracy theories, they must be bad. And that raises the question, how has this happened? Because some people think this is an outrage. This goes against what people think about conspiracy theories. So is there something in the water which is making philosophers like myself so deluded that we would treat conspiracy theories with even the slightest modicum of respect? And this is where we move away from history and we start moving into some baseless speculation based upon a philosopher's idea of how sociology might work. So that's one of the guns on North here. That is the disappearing gun. This is an example of what's called Victorian over-engineering. The gun was designed in such a way that when it's fired, it slides back into the hill so it can be hidden when it's being reloaded, making it almost impossible to be targeted by Prussian ships. It's Victorian over-engineering because Prussian ships' accuracy was such that they weren't going to be able to hit the gun reliably, whether it's hidden or not. So it's over-engineered. It solves a problem that didn't really exist, but that was the Victorian Empire as a whole, solving problems that didn't exist, all for the glory of Great Britain. Okay, so here are some questions you might ask about the philosophical work that's come out of the Antipodes. Why do we end up being particularists? Why are we interested in treating conspiracy theories with a modicum of respect and saying, look, we should assess them on their merits rather than just assuming they're bad? And you might think, well, look, maybe it's the size of our society. Aotearoa, New Zealand is a very small country by population size. I work in Zhuhai, which is in the south of China. Zhuhai has a population of 5.5 million people in the inner city area. It's considered to be more a town than a city. I live in Guangzhou, which is to the north of Zhuhai. It has a population of 17.5 million people. New Zealand, population-wise, very small. Most of us have probably had an interaction with a politician within the last few months or so. We know politicians, we associate with people who know politicians. We know our political class in a way that people in larger countries don't. So maybe it's the size of the population. We just know more people in respect to how politics works. It could be that as small countries on the edge of the world, we are a long way away from the real action. The real action, conspiracy theory-wise, at the moment seems to be claims about what's going on with the Epstein list in the US, whether the US was complicit in particular military actions in the Middle East or not, whilst we're having debates about whether David Seymour belongs to a libertarian think tank that likes to take holidays in Canada. Maybe it's the fact that we are interested in stuff which is going on overseas because we're a long way away from it. We are kind of one step back or resolved from it. And it might be that maybe we're just more conspiracy theory literate. Maybe as members of a small country on the edge of the world, we are just aware of more conspiracy theories elsewhere because they make the news. We find out about things like QAnon or Pizzagate, or various versions of 9/11 conspiracy theories and the like. And so I sat in my armchair, as a philosopher's wont to do, and I thought about these things. And then I went, I know a lot of people who are working in conspiracy theory. I should just ask, what do they think? So the following survey of views is, I got so many responses. So unfortunately, people who I reached out to, some of whom are in this audience, some of whom will be watching the live stream. I apologize, I haven't used your work, but I got so many different responses, and a talk can only be so long. But the responses I got were interesting. Steve Clark, who writes his paper in 2002, he got interested in conspiracy theories for one very simple reason. He was flying back from LA to Australia, and he wanted a book that would be very, very easy and undemanding to read on the plane. So he goes to the airport bookseller and picks up a copy of Gail Brewer Giorgio's Is Elvis Alive? So this is a book which basically goes through a series of arguments proving that the king of rock and roll faked his death and is recording music under another name, or at least was in 1993. It's very likely that if the king of rock and roll didn't die on a toilet, he probably is very much dead now. But in the 90s, it was still a group of people saying, look, it's viable, he is still out there, and we want to know what he's doing. And Steve reads this book and formulates on the plane an idea of, well, she seems to have a very motivated reasoning account. It's quite obvious that she wants the conclusion to be true and will change the evidence to fit it. So I'm just going to write something on that. What I did learn is that Steve is doing this sometime between 1993 and 1994. But he doesn't think there's anything that can be published on conspiracy theories until after David Cody releases his first work on conspiracy theories and official stories. So if Steve had decided to have a bit more gumption, it is possible that this talk either wouldn't be occurring or would be occurring at Wagga Wagga in Australia instead. So there's an alternative history here where it's Steve who gets to be the first Antipodean philosopher, and suddenly this is a story about the importance of Australia over that of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Truly a dark, dark timeline. So Steve tells us something. Steve is interested in conspiracy theories overseas, and as we'll see, maybe as an Australian, his distance from those theories might be the thing which informs the way he ends up thinking about these theories. Alex Sherman, who just finished writing a PhD on conspiracy theories in media studies, he talked about the fact that there is something really interesting about the Australian perspective towards conspiracy theories, in that people look at what is going on overseas, thinking that at some point in the near future, that stuff going on overseas will be imported into the Australian political landscape. So people are wary about the conspiracy theories going on elsewhere, but also cognizant that there are going to be people engaging in a conspiracy to bring that stuff home to then use as political rhetoric or discourse in their own society. Patrick Stokes, who we've already met, has said, well, look, there is something interesting about the Australian attitude towards conspiracy theories, in that we look at the conspiracy theories which are believed with absolute passion elsewhere, such as theories about the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and yet no one really spends a lot of time thinking about the conspiracy theories about their Prime Minister who disappeared after going for a swim one day, Harold Holt. And there are numerous conspiracy theories about Holt's disappearance, including that he was killed by members of the CIA or was either kidnapped or repatriated to China, where he's living out his days as a double agent who's returned back to his political homeland. And as he points out, this kind of gets brought up in internet memes in Australia, where you get these kind of interesting images of the iceberg, of the kind of conspiracy theories that Australians end up believing, which go from the somewhat plausible right down to the Emu War was a real war, if you know anything about Australian history, this is fascinating, or Australians who believe that Australia itself does not exist. Melina Sahapos, a friend of both Charles and I, finishing a PhD off on the conspiracy theories on conspiracy theory, is a Swedish Australian. So she grew up in Australia, lives in Sweden, and talked about how there is a different attitude towards notion of conspiracy in the Southern Hemisphere compared to many European nations. And that Australians seem to be much more open to the idea of there being not just corruption, but in some cases rampant corruption in their culture in a way that Swedes would never, ever think about. And so there are two threads worth picking up on here. There's this idea that there's an interest in conspiracy theories over there, that we are interested in the conspiracy theories that happen in the so-called larger nations that dominate our interest. Most people who are reading the papers in New Zealand are probably aware of there being a contra temps over the Epstein list in the United States. But a lot of New Zealanders are not aware of the conspiracy theories being spread about our current government with respect to tobacco lobbies possibly paying for health ministers' advice, or that our current Deputy Prime Minister might be working at the behest of a libertarian think tank. We seem to know a lot about foreign conspiracy theories and not that much about local ones in a way that might even verge on disinterest. And this might come out of the fact that when we do find out about conspiracies which are going on in our society, because of the smallness of our societies and the fact that we are more deeply interconnected on a political level than maybe some larger nations, when we find out about these conspiracies, we are more galled by them. The idea that actually finding out there are conspiracies going on here and now are the kind of things we end up going, that shouldn't happen here. And this is something that Patrick Brooks, he's just finished his PhD at Rutgers University in the philosophy of conspiracy theories, was saying, look, on one level, he would have thought Americans would be the more particularist-friendly philosophers here, rather than people in the Antipodes. And so that maybe there is something about being in a small polity, in a country at the edge of the world, which leads us to be more friendly to the idea that we should treat claims of conspiracy more seriously. This is a point that Brian L. Keeley made. We are at the edge of the world. We were also subject, as New Zealanders, to a terrible terrorist conspiracy 40 years ago, the bombing of the Rainbow Warrior. We're a major player in the EU, the Republic of France, both engaged in a conspiracy to blow up a ship in the Waitemata, and then engaged in a conspiracy to tell us that actually they would punish the terrorists rather than give them a military parade on their return and also promote them. So we also might be aware that as small players at the edge of the world, we are subject to conspiracies in a way where there really isn't any way for us to push back. And so I thought, look, we've got some great support for my sociological speculation, which is why it was really unfortunate the sociologist I taught to kind of poured cold water on all of this. So Martin Orr, who's a sociologist who works at Boise State University, which I've published several papers with, a sociologist who does a lot of very important work on the way that people talk about conspiracy theories. He, along with his colleague Jenna Husting, have talked about the way the label conspiracy theory has rhetorical force in the kind of conversations we have about it, was going, well, look, as a sociologist, sure, we can come up with lots and lots of interesting theories. The problem is once we start comparing those theories to other nations of a similar size or a similar distance, these theories kind of fall apart. If there's something in the water, we haven't really identified anything. We've just satisfied my intellectual curiosity in a way which doesn't have anything meaningful to say about the sociology of what's going on here in the Antipodes. So great theories, but at this stage, it is still looking like it's baseless speculation. But that probably doesn't matter. Because what I think might be at the heart of this is that, look, most philosophers, when they start out thinking about conspiracy theories, probably agree with the rest of the population that there must be something wrong with being a conspiracy theory. But if you spend a lot of time thinking about it, and you are very conspiracy theory literate, you're aware of the different conspiracy theories that occur elsewhere, you start to realize that generalizing about these things called conspiracy theories is a fool's errand. There are so many exceptions to the generalizations that actually they end up being worthless as generalizations to begin with. The only theoretical stance that seems to make sense is to treat the conspiracy theories seriously and ask, look, is this particular one worth investigating? Is this particular one that we might think could turn out to be true? And whether or not my sociological speculations have any basis in reality, it is the case that the work on the philosophy of conspiracy theory, which has emanated from this region of the world, has been work which has been based upon treating claims of conspiracy theory seriously and working out why, if the theory is bad, it is deservedly bad, and why do sometimes people not believe the conspiracy theories that turn out to be things that deserve to be believed as true. And this is important because this work isn't just now constrained to this region of the world. This work has been spreading through conspiracy theory as an interdisciplinary movement and is having a positive effect on the way that conspiracy theory theorists of all stripes globally are talking about these things called conspiracy theories. And so this takes us to the final act of our three-act play, the philosophy. So, as we've seen, philosophers have been interested in conspiracy theories arguably since the middle of the last century, realistically at the very end of the last century. There's flourishing work which has been produced, and this work is particularist in character. But that doesn't really mean anything if philosophers in the Southern Hemisphere are only talking to themselves. But philosophers in the Southern Hemisphere are not just talking to one another, they are in correspondence with academics across the world, and this work has meaning. One of the things which philosophers of conspiracy theory in the Antipodes have been really focused on is the fact that we need to know what we mean by the term conspiracy theory. For a very long time, the term conspiracy theory had a I know it when I see it style character. So if you're aware of Supreme Court judgments in the United States, there is the very famous case in which Justice Potter, when asked to define what counts as pornography, says, well, I don't know how to define it, but I know it when I see it. Now, one should ask how a Supreme Court justice knows pornography when one sees it, but we'll leave that question to one side. The idea was more, look, we all know what pornography is. It's just, we don't have to define it, we just know what it is. And the philosophical literature has been pointing out that academics have been relying on a I know it when I can see it standard for what counts as a conspiracy theory for a long time, in a way where it turns out most of us in conspiracy theory were talking about very different things and thus talking at cross purposes. Some people define conspiracy theories as being in opposition to official theories. So a conspiracy theory is only something which exists in opposition to an official narrative. Some people talk about conspiracy theories as always being false and never true. Some people talk about conspiracy theories as just being like any other theory. The research work they produced on the basis of those definitions was then being thought about by people who used radically different definitions. And the philosophers of the Southern Hemisphere have been saying, look, there are too many definitions in the academic literature. We really should get behind one particular definition, and arguably, if we want our work to be fruitful, we should get behind one which doesn't assume the research conclusion that assumes these theories are necessarily bad, but makes that badness a consequence of how particular theories end up being, say, inferences to a bad explanation, resting on the wrong kind of authority, being an example of a rhetorical theory rather than an example of someone actually believes. And so this idea that we should have a distinction between conspiracy theories and official theories is something that people have talked about a lot. As I mentioned here on the slide, people have been using the term conspiracy theory to deride people's views, often when actually engaging in conspiracies themselves. Tony Blair, when he was laundering the lie that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, accused his critics of being conspiracy theorists because he knew that labeling them as conspiracy theorists would make people think that they believed conspiracy theories, and we know conspiracy theories are wrong, right? If we remove the sting from the term conspiracy theory, then it makes life a lot easier to judge, was Tony Blair right or wrong? John Key, when he was Prime Minister, claimed that Nikki Hager's work, Dirty Politics, was the work of a conspiracy theorist. And we have to bless our media. The media said, yes, Nikki Hager is a conspiracy theorist, but is he wrong, Prime Minister? So they recognized there was sting in the term, but they also recognized there was something there. And we have, as former Deputy Prime Minister and current Deputy Prime Minister, ministers of our parliament, members of our parliament, who accuse their critics of either being conspiracy theorists or subject to a conspiracy. So we can remove the sting from these terms, say, look, a conspiracy theory is just a theory about a conspiracy, and we are all conspiracy theorists. Then we can improve public and intellectual debate. And psychologists in particular are beginning to pay more and more attention to the idea that we need to focus our attention on a definition rather than using multiple definitions. Now, this work is ongoing, so there's still a lot of work to be done to understand what kind of exemplar conspiracy theories we might want to use to motivate our work, and whether we want to focus our work on particular subsets of conspiracy theories. But the philosophical work has been informing the work in psychology, leading to better interdisciplinary conspiracy theory. And once again, it starts here. Particularists have also argued that, look, as Steve Clark and Charles Pigden has argued, there can be positive social consequences to being a conspiracy theorist. when we think about the people who doubted the official theory for the invasion of Iraq back in 2003, they were entertaining theories about governmental conspiracies that were at the level of two nations, one a superpower, one a former superpower, colluding together to manufacture evidence to drive a public debate to try and get the public on side for why they might really have wanted to invade Iraq back in 2003. And the same kind of questions are now being raised about the US's intervention in Iraq in the short-lived Israeli-Iranian war about a month ago. And the idea that there can be positive consequences to belief in conspiracy theories is something which particularists have pushed a long way and is now being adopted by people in the social sciences and by psychologists saying, look, we should also be studying why some people believe conspiracy theories for the right reasons, and as the psychologist Roland Imhoff has argued, why some people don't believe conspiracy theories that turn out to be true. And we've also been pushing ahead with trying to work out when we ought to believe particular instances of conspiracy theories. So a friend of ours, Alexios Stamatiadis Brea, an Athenian philosopher, so basically going all the way back to the Western tradition as we know it, he's been working on the genealogy of belief in conspiracy theories, particularly situations where people generate conspiracy theories to cover up the conspiracies they themselves are engaging in. And as he points out, it's really quite interesting that the people who denied that smoking causes lung cancer ended up being the people who denied the climate is changing and end up being senior advisors to the Republican administration today. Actually pointing out that genealogy also tells you something really interesting about the kind of politics that we're in. And philosophers have been integral in understanding why it is that appealing to experts is important in many situations, but it's not an infallible guide. Experts are sometimes wrong, and sometimes what appears to be an expert consensus ends up being part of a conspiracy, like the aforementioned smoking doesn't cause lung cancer, or petroleum use is not really connected to climate change whatsoever, where you have pet experts involved in a conspiracy. So philosophers have been pushing this idea that the investigation into these claims can have positive consequences for our understanding of how conspiracies might occur, not just now or in the future. And so to end where basically this almost began. Philosophers as far back as Charles and as current as Amsterdam student Julia Doets, also in the process of finishing her PhD in the philosophy of conspiracy theory, have been arguing that, look, if we want an intellectually respectable and theoretically fruitful conspiracy theory, then we need to be particularists. We need to assume that conspiracy theories are not necessarily bad. We need to ensure that is the conclusion of our research and not the beginning of our research. If we assume conspiracy theories are bad, all we're doing is asking is what makes a bad theory a bad theory. If we assume that conspiracy theories can be true, even if it turns out often they are not, then we're asking the more important question, is this particular conspiracy theory one that is worth entertaining? Or is this, like many theories, conspiratorial or other, a theory that we can cast to one side and say, look, that isn't a good explanation given what we know? And that has been the kind of tenor of the work, going all the way back to Charles, through all of the researchers that have come through, including myself, and this is having a positive effect on the field as a whole. We are now in a position to start analyzing conspiracy theories without necessarily assuming they're bad and working out why in some situations we ought not believe them anyway. And that is the end of my play in 3 acts.
Thank you very much for a fascinating and entertaining talk, and very thought-provoking and interesting. Now we have time for some questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll deliver the microphone to you. Thank you. Do you want to go to the...
And we're treating this as a kind of daytime talk show. If you want to make accusations and it's all fine.
Thank you for the talk. My question would be sort of the technological aspect that we're dealing with today. It seems that there's been a coinciding with how technology has grown exponentially and with how conspiracy theories have also risen with that. And I like to think about it how people in the past haven't had to experience such a complex world as we live in today. And in the past, maybe that was why conspiracy theories or authority was held to so strongly. And today we seem to have to interact with such complex a world around us, devices, and so many differing authorities. So what of impact is technology, or is there much theory to deal with how technology is exacerbating conspiracy theories?
Thank you. That's an excellent question, because there is actually some research on this. So on one level, yes, it's true. We live in an era where it's just a lot easier to find out what's going on elsewhere than it was 10 or 15 years ago. When I wake up in the morning now, my phone is sitting on the desk. I've got social media notifications. In the old days, I would have had to have gone and walked and get a newspaper to find out what may have happened overnight. So from a technological aspect, yes, we have a lot more access to information. And so it makes it a lot easier for us to find out about whatever is going on in the world, conspiratorial or otherwise. But the interesting thing about this is we also have a lot of polling data on belief in conspiracy theories. And what's interesting about that, so this is polling data done by the Pew Research Center in the US. So this is US-centric data, so we shouldn't generalize from that to the world as a whole. But at least in the US, we know the height of belief in conspiracy theories was the middle of the last century. And belief in conspiracy theories has been, with few exceptions, trending down over time. And there's been no bump in belief in conspiracy theories during the COVID-19 pandemic or the Trump presidency. It seems that we are in a really flat period of belief. The only beliefs which seem to be going up is that more Americans now than ever believe that JFK was killed by a conspiracy rather than a lone assassin, and more Americans than ever believe that the US government is hiding the existence of extraterrestrial contact. And that one's fascinating because historically, that was a Democrat belief. Republicans didn't believe it, Democrats did. Now it's a bipartisan belief, as many Republicans as Democrats believe that the US government is hiding the existence of aliens. So it's interesting, we know more about conspiracy theories, but we don't seem to believe them anywhere near as much as we did 70 years ago. And that's fascinating. That indicates that we find them entertaining and interesting, but that doesn't necessarily lead to belief. So yeah, it's an intriguing area, and people are doing research into this.
Thank you for the highly entertaining talk, Matthew.
Just M.
Sorry, just M.
Yeah, just M.
Thank you, M. Can I want to start by questioning the phenomenon you're trying to explain. So you started by making a distinction between generalists and particularists about conspiracy theories. You made a claim that many or most Australasians are particularists, and I think
at least in philosophy, yeah.
Okay, and let's just stick with philosophers. I assume you're making the claim also that, say, most Americans are not particularists. Is that right?
So if we look at the work that's coming out from the United States, you get some notable particularists like Lee Basham and Brian L. Keeley, but then you get work like people like Keith Harris, who admittedly is now working in the EU, but comes from the US, Daniel Munro, who's from the EU, but now working in the US. And in the US, it's tending more toward generalist philosophers than particularists at this stage, yes.
So
Oh, you need the mic. You need to put the mic closer to you because we're
Closer, right. So if I reflect on the literature that I've read, my sense is that nobody is a generalist in the sense of claiming that every conspiracy theory is false. I think most people think some conspiracy theories are true. It's just that they fall on a spectrum around whether or not most conspiracy theories are true, for example. And if that's the way you think about it, I think about some of the examples of some of the Australians you mentioned. I would have thought that the work of, say, Neil Levy, or who thinks about the role testimony plays in our epistemology, or the work of Steve Clark, who thinks about the psychology of the fundamental and thinking about whether or not conspiracy theorists are more vulnerable to the fundamental attribution error. I would have thought that some of those, if not many of those philosophers, were making a claim that most conspiracy theory, or there's something wrong with conspiracy theories. And so I'm just wondering if you're more nuanced in the phenomenon you're trying to explain. It's not clear to me that there's this division between us Australasians and, say, Americans. But I'd be interested in your reflections on that.
Okay, so on a kind of biographical note, so Steve Clark was a fan of the fundamental attribution era back in about 2007. He has capitulated on that view. So in an edited collection, which is by David Cody, Conspiracy Theories, a Philosophical Debate, he writes a paper, was appealing to the FAE a big mistake, in which he says, yes, it probably was. So Clark has a much more particularist view than he did when he was first writing at the time. It is true that Levy is amongst the Antipodean philosophers, the one who's the most likely to be a generalist, but that's because he has a very interesting view on social knowledge and the like, and the idea that if we give up on listening to experts, there are huge societal consequences. And I have issues with his views in general, but he is a generalist in the philosophical sense. But Clark is very much particularist friendly, if not particularist now. On the bigger claim, so what's going on elsewhere. So of course, it has to be slightly more nuanced than can be presented in a talk of 3 20-minute sections. It is true that ostensibly, a lot of the work in the social sciences and psychology seems like it should be particularist friendly. There are a lot of, in the end, particularist friendly definitions that get used in that literature. But it is also interesting that then the only examples that then motivate, now we're going to analyze these conspiracy theories, are the ones which are taken to be obviously false by the researchers. So they put forward conspiracy theories that most people agree are false, and they want to diagnose why do people believe that. And so I think there is a generalist tenor to the work that's coming out of a lot of that work in psychology, which is beginning to change with the work of Roland Imhoff, Kenza Nera and the like, basically challenging psychologists for centering those particular examples. And the important thing to note is generalism doesn't require you think all conspiracy theories are false. Very few people believe that. So Viram Swamy, the British psychologist, he defines conspiracy theories as false by definition. A few other researchers did that in the 2010s or so. Most of them say, well, look, some conspiracy theories can be true, but it's a very begrudging, yes, sometimes they can be true, but for the most part, they are false, and thus you are entitled to a prima facie skepticism of theories that bear that label. So yeah, I do think there is a lot more generalism out there. And maybe people in the social sciences and psychology are coming round to the philosophical work because they're beginning to realize there's a mismatch between their theoretical underpinning and the kind of work they've then done off the back of that theory. Oh, and there's also a gentleman in this row here who raised his hand at one point as well.
Okay, thank you. I just have really just a factual question about the notion of conspiracy. I mean, I know that notion comes up in social epistemology and you've argued that there are people who think that there are, conspiracy theories are necessarily prima facie at least problematic. But the notion comes up in law as well. And I think in the UK at least, conspiracies actually are, it's actually a designated crime, and there's a range of them that you can get, particular sentence tariffs for. Is it the case that in the philosophy of law, anybody's ever argued that convictions for conspiracy are prima facie unsafe? I suspect the answer to that is going to be no. And if that's right, why the asymmetry between the social epistemology case and the legal case?
That is an excellent question, because I've also wondered the same. Because it is interesting that from a legal perspective, conspiracies get prosecuted all the time. And conspiracies can be prosecuted because we uncover an actual conspiracy which has had an effect, and then we arrest people and deal with it. And sometimes we arrest people because we think they're going to engage in conspiracy. And so we have probative evidence that says, well, look, they were about to engage. And of course, sometimes you get governments who arrest people on the basis of non-existent conspiracies. So we had the dreadful case back in 2008, the Aotearoa raids, where using the Terrorism Suppression Act, the police and the government prosecuted a terrorist conspiracy to engage in terrorist acts against the President of the United States. Notably, these terrorists were going to kill President Bush by building a catapult and launching a bus at his head. That was their evidence of a large-scale conspiracy to kill the president. And so, yeah, it's interesting. We seem to accept that criminal conspiracies occur, and we actually seem to accept that we can apply that label and prosecute people all the time. And yet there does seem to be a distaste about talking about political conspiracies. And yeah, I think that is a really interesting mismatch, because if we add in the criminal or legal aspects, because not all conspiracies are under the criminal code, some are civil conspiracies, we seem really happy to prosecute those. And yet there seems to be a reluctance to talk about the political case. Some theorists have thought this might just be a case of a kind of political piety. It's better to think that you live in a society where political conspiracies don't occur, because you don't really want to be suspecting that politicians are up to no good. I lived in Bucharest in Romania for 2 years doing my first 2 postdocs. Romanians are very happy to consider that there are conspiracies going on at the governmental level, because Romania is a moderately corrupt polity and conspiracies go on at the governmental level all the time. So yeah, there's a really interesting asymmetry there. There is some work, so Julia Dutz, who I mentioned before, her first degree is in law and is now doing a PhD in philosophy on conspiracy theories. And she's interested in looking at the things that look like conspiracies from the philosophical perspective, but don't get talked about as conspiracies from a legal perspective. And so she's looking at the role of multi-level marketing in the United States, which is a pyramid. Well, so they call it a trapezoid scheme now, because pyramid schemes are illegal, but has all the characteristics of a conspiracy. It had to be defined as non-conspiratorial under the criminal code by law to allow these things to function. So yeah, there's some interesting work to be done there, and is being done.
Thanks, Em. If I caught your submissions correctly, you're saying that there's been a general decline in conspiracy belief worldwide. If we look outside academia to the general population, and a world of different facts and technology taking really large leaps in the ability to create evidence, what the layperson may see as evidence, are we in fact seeing worldwide people drifting to not really having certainty in the information they're being fed? And so the ability to trend towards a conspiracy theory is in fact hindered by people's general uncertainty about the information that comes through all media to them.
I mean, that's a really interesting hypothesis there. So I do have a particular view on this. So it is true that at the point in time we get the height of conspiracy theories, at least within US discourse, is also around about the height of high institutional trust in US institutions. And then you get a series of events, which is going on worldwide, but in the US you get things like the Tuskegee syphilis experiment being revealed. And you start to get a reduction in trust in institutions in the US. And it is interesting, as people become less trustworthy of institutions, conspiracy beliefs aren't going up. So maybe it's because we no longer have trusted people that we listen to, and so people just have fewer beliefs in general about politics. That is a hypothesis we could put forward. The other thing is that maybe we just had too much trust in institutions in the first half of the 20th century, that the base level of trust is actually somewhat near where we are now, and actually we just had too much trust in institutions over the course of the beginning of the 20th century up to the middle, which is why they were then able to launder that high trust and go, well, people aren't going to question what we're doing. So you get the unfortunate experiment here, you get Tuskegee over in the US and the like. So there also might be that thing going on. Maybe beliefs in conspiracy theories aren't going up, but it's because it's a weird interplay between high trust and the realization that people that we trust are also up to no good. And as we have lost that trust, we're now weirdly slightly less suspicious about what they might be doing. But these are all sociological theories, so it's probably best to leave that to a cultural studies scholar, media studies scholar, sociologist, or anthropologist. I am just, in many cases, baselessly speculating as to what that causal mechanism might be. Yeah.
Oh, thanks for just a fabulous talk. I was trying to figure out why it was that I felt so briefly angry and frustrated when you flipped past the iceberg slide so quickly.
Would you like to feel angry again? Because I can make that work.
I have a feeling I'm not the only one.
All right, let's go back.
And I have a potential theory for why I felt that way.
Now, do you want the top of the iceberg or the bottom?
Give me the bottom. Of course. Right? Maybe it has something to do with structure rather than truth, right? I mean, the narrative structure of these things is just absolutely gorgeous with the arc and the characters. I just wondered what you thought of that idea.
I mean, there is work on this. So there are people like Daniel Munro who are talking about the role of imaginative play in the presentation of conspiracy theories. And he's building on the work of Regina Rini, who's also written similar stuff on this material. And I think one thing we need to be very cognizant of when we're talking about conspiracy theories that people purportedly believe, that doesn't necessarily mean that they assert them or endorse them as being true. There are a lot of conspiracy theories that people share around the water cooler, but they're doing it because it's a fun social activity. They're not necessarily asserting things they believe. They're expressing to people things that they find amusing, or they think other people find amusing, or in some cases, they're saying because they want to troll the other person they're talking with by making it look like they believe something just to get a particular reaction. So yes, I think the narrative structure of some of these, because some of these theories are kind of delightful. All world history can be explained by the existence of alien shape-shifting reptiles who infested our planet thousands of years ago and thus enslaved us in a prison planet. It's got a wonderful narrative structure, and some people may believe it, and some people may just be playing along because it's fun to talk about. This is actually something that Brian L. Keeley made, a comment he made in Miami back in 2016 when Joe Yasinski ran a really big conference there. And on the last day he said, look, we've had 2.5 days of talk and they've been really po-faced. We've been talking about the danger of belief in conspiracy theory X or why conspiracy theory X isn't true, but none of us have been talking about how wonderful some of these theories are to talk about. And that there should be slightly more play in the kind of examples that they use. Now, in my own work, and this often identifies me to reviewers, I like to use local examples. I have a bit of colour from our region of the world. And so there is kind of a need to talk about different kinds of examples. And I think once we start talking about different kinds of examples, then the structure of those examples and the way the structures either aid or disaid belief in them, I think is vitally important.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more quick question, if there is anyone. Okay. All right. Well, in that case, I'd like to invite you all to, we're having a reception in the staff club after this. It's downstairs in the staff club, the gallery room. So you're all welcome to come and join us for that. Thank you very much for coming. And please join me in thanking Em for a fascinating and wonderfully entertaining talk. Thank you.
Thank you.